So, what is depression? What is chronic clinical depression? Now, I'm not talking about everybody goes through the blues, melancholy seasons, and some are more prone to it than others. Everybody goes through difficult seasons. And if you're a mom, for instance, you may have experienced what it's like to go through postpartum depression, or you may have experienced what they call SAD. I think it's seasonal affective disorder or something like that, or I don't know if I got that right. But we all go through these seasons of the blues and melancholy, and they're real things. And I don't want to minimize that. If you've ever gone through some of those seasons or are prone to some of that, you know the pain and the frustration and all that is accompanied with it. What I'm talking about is chronic clinical depression, the depression that is paralyzing. It's all-encompassing. It completely encapsulates a person and changes them, and it's profound, and it's deep, and it's dark, and that's what I'm going to address today. What is it? How does it affect people? Why does it affect people? We often think of depression. I'm going to kind of do some technical language, and I'm not a doctor, and I'm not very good. I was terrible in biology. So if you have a good mind for this, you work in the medical profession, or you're a counselor, I'm going to say things, and if I get it wrong, what I'd like you to do is stroke your chin and smile and agree with me, and then you can privately correct me after the message. So I'm going to do the best I can with this. But our emotions, a lot of times we think that the emotions come from our heart, and we know that that's true. Our emotions is not true. Our emotions come from our mind. And there's a lot of different factors. In fact, over the last 20 years, when Maria's dad first began to show signs of depression, it was 20 years ago. We know a lot more about it now than we did then. So sometimes it's our temptation to say it's this, or it's this, or it's this single thing. It's a spiritual condition. It's a chemical condition. It's a genetic condition. It's a medical condition. When the fact of the matter is, it's kind of all of those pieces. It's very complicated. It's very complex. It shifts and it moves. Different seasons and different times. It can be something starting out in a person's life, and it can be something very different later. So it's really difficult to diagnose and treat. But some of the things that we do know is that there are several components, and one of them is a chemical component. And for those of us that sort of, maybe know, there's neurons that we have that have to do with the central nervous system, and the neurons have to connect. They have to talk to each other. And so it's called neurotransmission, and they have to talk with one another. There's a space called a synapse in between each of these neurons, and they transmit information to one another, and there's chemicals that do that called neurotransmitters. And when those neurotransmitters aren't working, then these neurons aren't talking. They're not communicating with one another. And so this has to do with how we learn, how we think, motor skills, and it has a deep impact on our emotions and how we feel things. And so depending on how these neurotransmitters are working or not working can have a deep impact on our psychosis. And so then if we have certain things that aren't hitting, so for instance, if we have depleted levels of serotonin, that's one of those neurotransmitters, then we're more prone to suicide. So people that commit suicide typically have very low levels of serotonin. But serotonin is not the only issue. People that have low levels of dopamine, for instance, will hallucinate. Will have schizophrenic behavior. They'll be delusional. Mariano had a lot of those things. He would see terrible hallucinations. He thought people were trying to kill him and to harm him, and he had all these horrible feelings because he was likely low on dopamine. And there's other things. Glutamate is another one that people that are low on that will be prone towards bipolar disease. Bipolar disease is where you have this manic behavior where you can conquer the world and do everything, and you stay up for days, and you have all these crazy ideas, and you bounce one thing to the next, and then you kind of plummet, and then the next day you'll be, I have a good friend of mine that's it's just terrible. It's hard to control, and he's actually managed to live with it and control it and manage it, but it takes a lot of discipline. So that you can if you have all these different levels, it impacts the way we see things, and there's other ones as well. So there is a component of chemical imbalances and when we take when we take mood enhancers or antidepressants, what that does is it helps those neurons communicate. And so, like, if you've ever gone to the doctor, they're not just, and we need to understand this, they're not just drugging you, okay? Sometimes we think, oh, they're just taking these drugs. Well, they're not taking these drugs. We're not just, like, loading people up on pharmaceuticals so that they can somehow feel better. What it's doing is it's helping these neurons communicate. And so, and sometimes there's kind of you have to experiment. So if you've ever been through it, your doctor might say, hey, try this for a couple of weeks and see if it works. And if it doesn't work, they'll experiment with different things because you don't know exactly what's going to work. So the chemicals in our brain are a big part of it. Genetics is also a big part of it. Just a beginning look at the pathology of somebody who has struggled with mental health. One of the first things they'll ask you is, does it run in your family? Do you have people that struggle with this in your family? And almost always they do. In fact, people that have bipolar disorder, they have about 50% of them or more have family members, siblings that also struggle with bipolar disease, bipolar disorder. So it's very common. It runs in families. And what happens genetically is our genes make proteins constantly that sort of then balance our life, and they help us to be able to move and grow and think and our organs to work correctly and all these things. But when genetically it doesn't quite work right, then it can cause all kinds of challenges, particularly with our moods and our emotions and the way we think. And one of the solutions for it in extreme cases is they go through a process called electroshock therapy, or they don't call that anymore. They call it electroconvulsion therapy. This was something that Mariano did, and frankly, it's very effective, but it's frightening. What they do is they sedate the patient, and they put voltage through their body that makes the person convulse. And somehow, in fact, now they probably know more about it then, but 20 years ago when this happened, the doctor said, look, we don't really know why it does it, but somehow it kind of recalibrates the genes so that it makes the appropriate protein, so then the brain and the mind work effectively. So this is something that we've experienced. It used to be pretty dangerous. People would break bones as they clenched and they convulsed, but now they put the patient under. They're able to control pinpoint the area. So it's better now, but it's very effective. So you have these sort of physiological components of the chemicals in our mind and the genes in our body, the genetics of how we're wired. But there are other factors that they're learning more and more about. In fact, stress is a big part of what brings on these episodes of depression. And what happens and it can be a stressful, a traumatic event that happens in our life, like the loss of a job, catastrophic income, catastrophic event that causes financial hardship. It can be the death of a loved one, a divorce. It can be all kinds of things. These traumatic events that causes stress in our life. It can be something that happened when a person was young, if they were sexually abused or physically abused, or if they had separation from their parents. One of the interesting things is it used to be thought that Latinos had a higher rate of depression than Anglos, but what they actually find out is that the depression rates are higher in Latino immigrants. So people that come to our country, they have higher ratios of depression for a couple of reasons. Partly because they don't have access to health care, and they often don't have access to health care, and they don't always talk about it because it's not really well understood. But one of the big reasons is there's separation from families. And a lot of times these immigrants come over when they're young and they've been separated from their families, and it causes these levels of stress. So there's lots of these factors. What happens when a stressful event happens is the hypothalamus in our brain triggers a reaction in our pituitary gland, which triggers a reaction in our adrenal gland, and then our body is flooded with cortisol, and we begin. It triggers that fight or flight mechanism in us. When we kind of get all geared up for this traumatic event. But in some people, that loop doesn't shut back off. It stays on. And so then these reactions they had to a stressful environment remain, and then they become depressed and have other psychosis that then can be troubling. And so that's one of the things that that happens in a person that struggles with depression. So there's environment and stress. And then finally, there's medical conditions. If a person has Alzheimer's or Huntington's disease or Parkinson's disease or cancers, other things that can trigger these responses. And so if you look at these different components of it, particularly for like genetics and for the chemical imbalances in our mind, we need medical attention for that, don't we? Like I believe, as a pastor and as a Christian, a person of faith, I know that Jesus heals, okay? And I believe in the power and the healing touch of God. But I also believe in going to get the medical attention that you need. We believe that God can heal cancer, and I've had cancer and I've been healed. But I also went to a doctor. And I've seen how God will sometimes remarkably and extraordinarily heal people, but it is the height of irresponsibility when a person has a medical condition to say, don't see a doctor, but claim your healing by faith. Well, we need to do the same thing with mental health. If a person has a medical disease in their mind, even though it's often misunderstood and sort of kind of lays below the surface of all of our understanding, we need to ensure that that person gets the medical help they need. So particularly with genetics and chemicals, you have to get medical attention. You're going to need some medicine. You're going to need some therapy to kind of get that right. The other part of it is lifestyle things. So there are things that we can do to alleviate stress. We can, and I've been around a long time and worked with a lot of people that struggle with depression. And one of the things that I've seen happen, probably the most effective thing, is when people change their habits. They learn to live more healthy. They eat whole food, healthy food. They exercise. They lose weight. They stop smoking. They stop drinking. They go through some of these processes. It makes a world of difference, and because your body now is more able to cope with the stressful situations of life. So a change in lifestyle can make a big difference. And of course the medical condition is something that we can't do anything when we have some of these catastrophic illnesses. But if we learn to live in a more healthy way, then the likelihood of us getting them in the first place is diminished. So we have this aspect of getting the professional help, getting the chemicals and the drugs and the treatments necessary, adjusting lifestyle. And so you kind of look at it like a three-legged stool. One is our physiology. One is our how we live and conduct our lives, our habits, our lifestyles. And then the third leg of that stool would be faith. I'm a person of faith. I'm a pastor. I believe in the power of healing. I believe in doing all that we can to understand who we are as men and women of faith and surrounding ourselves with people of faith. So when we look at mental health from a perspective of a three-legged stool, and all of those stools, that's my phone dinging, by the way, so I have nobody to be annoyed at but myself. When all those legs are firmly in place, it tends to bear really great results. But sometimes when all of those stools, all of those legs are in place, we still have problems. Let me tell you about Maria's dad. Maria's dad was one of the most extraordinary guys I've ever known. Really just a wonderful, tremendous guy. And he was just always so kind to me. One of the fondest memories I have is when him and I went out for a drink and I asked him if I could marry his daughter. And here I am, this long-haired rock and roll guy, and I asked him, and he said, Jimmy, he always called me Jimmy. He said, everybody deserves a chance to be happy, and marriage made me happy, and you deserve a chance to be happy. So yes, I give you my blessing, make my daughter happy. And what was interesting is, him and the rest of the family, we tend to think of Hispanic, Mexican families as sort of, they're coming into our culture, but in my case, it was different. I was going into theirs. And so I was just embraced into their culture. It was really wonderful. And so I know I don't look it, but I feel really super Mexican, so. So he's just this wonderful, wonderful man. And his dad died. He's a Mexican immigrant. His dad died when he was a young guy. And so when he was 11 and 12 years old, he would watch all of the, he grew up on a ranch, and he would guard the cattle. So he's an 11, 12-year-old. He'd sleep under the stars, just on the ground, with his dog, protecting the cattle from wild animals and thieves, and you know, it's just incredible courage. And then when he was a young man, he couldn't stand the corrupt Mexican government. You know, the Mexican government, particularly then, was just very, very corrupt. He couldn't deal with it anymore, and he came to the States. So he came to the States as a young man, left everything behind, just the clothes on his back, and he came to the United States. He began working in the fields. He worked the orchards, the orange orchards, and he got a family sponsored him, and he became he got his green card. And then a buddy of him said, I'll teach you how to work in the mills. And so he began this up in Oregon, and he began to work in the mills, and eventually worked his way down to Northern California, where he settled. And so he was always a really hard worker, and just went above and beyond, and just was endured extraordinary hardship and suffering as he built himself up, literally just built himself out of nothing, had nothing but just the clothes on his back. And got married. He was 40 years old. He married a woman 15 years younger than him, so attaboy. And so he married Lydia. A lot of you have met Lydia. And they had 4 wonderful kids, and I happen to marry one of them, so yay me. And he just did an outstanding job. He was a hard physical worker. I mean, this guy could outwork. He died when he was 72, and he could outwork anybody. I mean, this guy was a stud. He pulled green chain all his life. If you're familiar with mill work, he pulled green chain. Maria tells a story of one time they brought the students of her school in to sort of observe what people did for a living, and she understood how hard and how physical a job it was for her dad, and she cried. It was just such a hard, demanding work, pulling green chain. He was always a kind of a simple guy. He never made a lot of money, but the money that he made, people thought he was rich. People thought he was rich. He would always brag. He'd say, my sons, my daughters, their wives and husbands, they all make more money than me. And he was really proud of that, because he left a heritage of education and employment to people that followed. That was a huge value to him. But he always lived simply. He bought a house. He paid it off. He would run cattle on the property, so that when and then he would work in the mill for 40 or 50 hours a week, always worked whatever overtime they'd give him. Then he'd come and he'd work the cattle. And then he'd sell the cattle, and with that, he paid off the property, he paid off the house, he bought some rental properties, and the dude just was amazing. And he was so generous with his money. He was constantly helping people. People were always asking him for help and for money, and he was just the most generous guy I ever knew. He never had... There was didn't exist with him. If you asked him, he'd give it if he could. Very, very generous. People thought he was rich. He wasn't. Was just this wonderful, generous guy. In fact, a well-known rancher in that area was talking about Mariano, and they explained to him. He said he's like the Mexican godfather of Northern California. He helped hundreds, maybe thousands of people, of Mexican immigrants get jobs, learn the language. You always tell them, learn the language so people don't resent you. Learn the language, get jobs, come here, go through whatever process to be legal. And he was just extraordinary. He supported the church, very faithful, generous with his money, supported the work of God, supported the local church. Everybody knew him. He was the guy that would throw the parties and had the celebrations when somebody got married, or there was a quinceañera, or whatever it was. He was the guy doing it. Everybody loved Mariano. He worked in his later 50s, if I have the story right. He saw that the cattle would be hard for Lydia, his wife, to manage as they got older. So he got rid of all the cattle, and he planted olive trees on the 10-acre property that he had. And the idea was, he said, my grandkids will benefit from these olives. He planted fruit trees all over the property, because he said, my grandkids will eat this fruit, and they'll... And to this day, when we go back home, we'll pick the strawberries he planted. And that's the kind of guy he was. He always was thinking ahead. He was always thinking of other people. He was always thinking of his family. Every year, Lydia will go buy new furniture or some new thing because of or put a roof on the house because of those olives that he planted. Just one of those guys that was always thinking ahead. He never thought he would see his grandchildren because he didn't get married till he was 40. And so when Sophie was born, he just adored that little girl. That was the apple of his eye. His whole life, when Maria was pregnant, he knew the days. He knew the days until she was going to have that baby. He just was that devoted to his grandchildren and his children. And the fact that he just got to experience the love of his granddaughter, he never thought he'd see that. So he's very grateful for that. He worked till his mid-60s, and he took retirement. And a lot of times what happens with older men in particular is that when their life changes a lot, this is kind of when depression will kick in. Now, he probably, as we look back and as we've learned about it, he probably had it his whole life. In fact, I know he did. He had it his whole life, but because he was such a hard worker and such a physical guy, and because he was always looking out to the needs and the benefit and the help of other people, we just never knew. But he probably, there's no doubt that he had this his whole life. But when he retired, now he wasn't as busy. He didn't have hobbies and things that he'd like to do that were as physically demanding on him. So he, there was that. And then right at the same time, his brother died, and he loved his brother, his older brother, and that's another thing that will happen, particularly with older men, if they start having some of these lifestyle changes, and older women too, by the way, and they see their loved ones will die, and so that the trauma and the stress of those will then be one of the triggers for depression. So it was kind of a perfect storm for him. He retired, his brother died, he was with his brother down in Southern California, got him to the hospital, and 45 minutes later his brother had died. And it had a deep, deep, powerful effect on him. It was really very traumatic for him. And he got sick. He got sick, and he got sick fast. And when I mean sick, he didn't go through like the blues and some melancholy. He got sick. He got delusional. He hallucinated. He wouldn't recognize Sophie, who was the apple of his eye. It's like he could feel nothing towards her. It was so difficult. He didn't recognize people. His face changed. He had, I don't want to be, he looked different. He didn't look alive. He was a different guy. This wasn't a guy that was just feeling bad. He was paralyzed with this. He was sick. He was not the same Mariano we knew. And we took him to the doctor, and the doctor said, this is so severe and so quick, we need to get him down to Sacramento, which is a couple of hours south of where we lived. We need to get him down there for electroconvulsion therapy. So we took him down there. And this was just within a few months, 2 or 3 months. So we took him down there, and I don't know if you've ever had to do that, and I don't know if the laws here in Iowa are the same or if they've changed, but then when you take a person into a mental hospital like that, they can't be released until they're better. So you take them in and you commit them. And as soon as we did it, as soon as we signed the paper, we're like, oh my gosh, we've made the worst mistake, because it was just terrible. Here's this guy that lived his whole life. He was a sharp dresser. He was always shaved, and his hair was always combed, and he always just looked great and smelled great. And he was disheveled, and he was whiskers, and hair was all over, and it was just horrible. And we didn't think we were ever going to get him out. And in fact, they couldn't even start the treatment because his blood pressure was too high, and they had to get the blood pressure down, and there's things that needed to happen. So it was about a week, maybe a week and a half or something like that. It was just terrible. And then finally, they did the procedure. And I'm telling you, like that fast, it was like a day. I think it was a day. It might have been a day or two. The first day was just remarkable, and then there were a few other treatments, but it was night and day. It was like we'd gotten Mariano back. You could see it in his eyes. He was back. He smiled. He recognized people. He talked about things that he loved, and he was back, and it was just remarkable. So the doctor told us, he said, this was such a severe case that came on so strong. He says it's going to come back, but when it does, bring him back, and we'll do the procedure again. So we felt really confident. We felt like we had the solution. We understood it. And this is like in 94, 95, 93, 94. And so then in between that transition, as a lot of you know, is when I came out of playing professional music and then got into ministry. And so there was a lot of things going on in our lives. And after two or 3 years, Philip was born. It began to come back. And I was at the church, and I was working, and there's just a lot of things going on, and it began to come back. And one of the things that we look back on that we realized is that he had learned how to mask it better. He'd learned how to hide it. He'd lived with this and dealt with it, and so he was sort of learning how to keep it from us. But we knew he was sick. I took him to the doctor, and we said, should we take him back down for more of this treatment? And he said, no. He says, he's healthy, his levels look good, and it seems like he's responding well to medication. Let's just keep trying this. So that's what we kept doing. We kept going to counseling and taking the medicine, and it kind of continued on, and it got worse. And then one day, Maria's mom and Maria and her sister went to Sacramento. Lydia was going to take her citizen exam, become a citizen of the United States, and they left Mariano with a family, with a relative. The relative had left him just for a moment, and he got in a car, drove off to a remote piece of property that we had, and shot himself. And it was totally out of the blue. We knew he was sick, but we had no idea the depth of what he was feeling. And in fact, I was at a staff meeting at the church, and I got the phone call, and Maria was like, "You have to come home," and I knew what had happened. And after all the stuff, we finally got home late at night, and we played our answering machine. It was back when you had answering machines. We hit the button. It was the doctor that said, "Hey, we got all of Mariano's tests back, and all his levels look good, and looks like things are moving forward." And we were like, well, not exactly. It was devastating. And we had the funeral, and we did the best we could. I think it was the hardest thing I think I've ever done, we've ever done. It was terrible, and part of what's so terrible about it is the family is not really allowed to grieve appropriately. Instead of like sort of celebrating this unbelievable life that this wonderful man lived, there's this kind of pall that hangs over it. And people start saying things, and they say stupid things and things that they're well-intentioned. They say, well, he was selfish, and he was, or he was weak, or he was, made a mistake. And I couldn't figure that out. I'm like, really? He was selfish. This guy that lived his whole life, that helped hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, that just gave his money away so generously, that would do anything for you, that never had, to my knowledge, everything he did was for other people, for his family, for his friends. Really, you're telling me this sort of final act was a selfish one, really? It didn't make sense to me. He was self-absorbed, really. This guy that just lived his life for other people was self-absorbed. He was weak. Oh, okay, really. So the guy that stood out and when he was a 10, 11, 12-year-old boy and would guard his father's sheep, his family cattle, and keep them safe, sleep under the stars by himself, was fearful, really. The guy that came to a new country, a new culture, new language, left everything behind through dangerous times when he's in his early 20s. He lacked courage, really. I couldn't get there. He lacked joy, really. the guy that was the life of the party, that would throw these huge community parties. Everybody knew him. Everybody loved him. One of the characteristics of Mariano is everybody loved him. In fact, at the funeral, you know how in funerals the first row is saved for families? Everybody was like saying, oh, I'm like family. I mean, there was like row after row after row of people that were like, no, I'm family. No, Mariano would want me to be here. That's just the way he was. If you knew him for 5 minutes, he was your best friend. Really, he lacked joy. He didn't have people that loved him. Really, you're telling me this guy, if we'd had under normal circumstances, if he'd just died of a normal death, there'd have been 1,000 people at his funeral. Really. Everybody knew him. Everybody loved him. He didn't have people in his life that loved him? Really. He lacked faith. Really. Days before, literally, and not weeks, days before, I don't remember exactly, he believed he was healed. He had this lucid moment where he believed that he was completely healed by God. He'd prayed and believed that he was healed. You're telling me that guy lacked faith? I couldn't get there. I couldn't get there. And we began to learn, we began to study, and if you've ever gone through this, it changes so many things about you. There were things on television I couldn't watch anymore. You know, you might watch a cop show and you'd see sort of a traumatic gun injury and you couldn't watch it. You couldn't, things that you would say, things that maybe I thought were funny or things, we weren't anymore. Statements that I would make about, you know how people, oh, the party was so boring, I just wanted to shoot myself. Well, I didn't say that anymore. I didn't even like, and I'm kind of an outdoorsman, and I am an outdoorsman. I love to shoot. And I didn't even want to see a gun. I didn't even, kind of took them all out of my house. I just couldn't. It's terrible. It sucks. But I began to ask these questions. I began to learn and study it more. And I learned some things about why couldn't he see the love that he had in his life? No. He had a disease that kept him from seeing all of the love or feeling the love. He couldn't. He was physically impossible to see it. He had a disease that kept him from feeling the things he would normally feel. Couldn't he see the devastation that he would leave behind people? No. He had a disease that kept him from seeing it. In fact, one of the things that we learned is that it's really common when people struggle with depression that they don't typically kill themselves when they're feeling the lowest, because they feel weak, they feel they don't have the strength to do it. It's when they start to kind of climb out and they start to feel better, they feel more courage, but they know this season is coming, and it's when they start to kind of go down and they know it's coming. And that's when they do it, and they don't see it, and this is important for us to understand, they don't see it as something, they're not taking the easy way out. They're not trying to just bypass this bumpy road. They see this as helping their family. They say, I'm going back into this pit of despair, and I can't drag my family through that again. I cannot drag my family through that again. So the way they see it, they see this act as an act of courage. They say, I have to do this. It's hard, but I have to do this for the benefit of my family, for the benefit of my friends. I can't continue to be a burden to them. Now, we know that's not true, don't we? And if I could have shouted it from the rooftops and stopped it, I would have. If I could have explained to Mariano what a blessing you are to hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people and how much this will hurt, the emptiness it will leave in their lives, if I could have convinced him of that, I would have. But I didn't have the opportunity. He didn't see it that way. He had a disease that the only thing in his life that he could see was that he lacked worth. He was a burden. He had to do this because he was sucking his family down into this pit with him. That's the way they see it. We know it's not true, but they don't. He's not seeing it as a choice. If he could just choose to be healthy, if he could just choose to think a different way, he would. He couldn't. He had a disease that kept him from seeing it. I look at this man who was so faithful, so generous, so kind, so selfless. And this act, so brave and courageous, this act was so inconsistent with the rest of his life. There's no way I could get there. And I began to reflect, and in particular of late, I reflect on a verse in Ephesians, and Paul is using it to teach the church about marriage. And the highest ideal for Paul is the way Jesus loves his body, the church. And he says, so husbands, you love your own bodies as well. So you're supposed to love your wife like that, because the Bible says that when we get married, we become one body. And so in Ephesians 5, Paul has this verse. He says, no one ever hated their own body, but they feed it. They care for it. For Paul, the pinnacle of value, second only to the body of Christ, is our own bodies. The most natural thing for us to do is to love and care and to feed and to rest our bodies, isn't it? It's what we do. When we're little babies, when we eat and we sleep and we poop, everybody goes, oh, he's such a good baby. Now, unfortunately, when you get a little older, that's no longer the mark for good or bad, but it's the most basic instinct we have, to care for our bodies. So when I see people who are hurting themselves, there should be these red flags that are going off. Something's wrong, something's wrong, something's wrong. When I see people who are anorexic and they're literally starving themselves, and they'll starve themselves to death if they don't get help. When I see that happening, they're not doing the most basic thing that they're designed to do, to feed your own body. They're hating their own body because something traumatic has happened in their life. They need help. They're not making a choice to hate their body. They need help. When I see people cut themselves because they've got so much pain in their life that they physically hurt themselves, they cut themselves, they need to be helped. Every red flag should be going, something's wrong. We're not made like this. Something's drastically wrong. This was true with Mariano. Something was drastically, horribly wrong. We know a lot more about it now than we did then. He needed help. One of the things that we've learned through this process, it's a very, very painful process, and it still is. One of the things that we've learned is we want to talk about it. As hard as it is, we want to talk about it, not to dredge up a lot of pain, but we don't want what happened in our family to happen in your family. We don't. Church has got to do a better job of responding to it and learning about it. You're not just going to pray yourself out of this. You're not going to sit down and do more family devotions or get a Joyce Meyer book and pull yourself out of it. It doesn't work that way. This is deep, and it's dark, and it's paralyzing. One of the things that we've learned is it's very important not to project your experiences onto other people. Now, it's important to share your experience, but not to project, because some people will say, well, I had some depression, and I don't want to minimize. I had depression, and I dealt with it, and here's how I dealt with it. And so that person should deal with it the same way, and it worked for me, it'll work for you. Well, I'm not talking about this. I'm not talking about, and I don't want to minimize people's depression. And I know everybody thinks theirs is the worst, is the worst, is the worst. This is the depression that is on the ground floor. It is so paralyzing. It's so disabling. It's so deep that what works here may not. And every healthcare provider, or healthcare professional will tell you the same thing. It is different for every single person. That's the first thing. We need to not project our experience on them. We also need to not project our experiences on the people who have gone through what we've gone through. So, for instance, if you had a loved one who died, who killed themselves, it may not have the same characteristics that were evident in our case. It might be different from you. There's lots of reasons people kill themselves, and depression is not the only one. So sometimes people do kill themselves for selfish reasons. I've heard of people who've killed themselves to avoid going to prison or to avoid having, an affair or some behavior get exposed. They'll kill themselves because they have a lot of debt and they want to, there's all kinds of things. There's all kinds of things that people will kill themselves for. And if you have one of those experiences where you kind of know why, maybe there was a note, maybe there's something like that, here's what I want to tell you. First of all, a single act doesn't send a person to heaven or to hell, whatever we believe about heaven and hell. One act doesn't do that. So in spite of what sometimes you hear, a person might have lived his whole life and made one terrible decision. But his whole life or her life is not defined by that. And maybe it was a terrible decision, and maybe it was a selfish decision and hurt a lot of people, but still their life is not defined by that. So now, they may have been saved before, they may not have been saved before. I don't know that, but what I'm saying is the eternal state of that person's soul, his afterlife, will be determined by whether or not Jesus saved him, whether or not Jesus imparted new life to him and he believed it. In other words, one act doesn't define it. So if you have a person in your life that committed this terrible act, suicide, and you do feel like, it was bad and it was selfish and it was all those things, well, first of all, I'm really, really sorry. And here's what I would encourage you to do. Look kind of beyond your pain, learn to forgive, learn to kind of move forward. And if you're having a hard time moving forward, get some professional help. Get some people you can talk to. There's some great counselors right here at this church that would love to talk you through that. Get the help you need and move forward. The second person that I want to address is this. If you've had someone die in your life, and maybe you don't really understand why, a person committed suicide, you don't really understand why. You know what I found? Is that when you begin to study it and you begin to see the characteristics, and by the way, all the information that I said today it is plastered all over the internet. Most of what I talked about today came from harvard.edu. They have more on it than you will probably ever care to read. But when you start to study it, what happens? You'll start to say, wait a second, that sounds like my aunt, or that sounds like just preaching this in between services, I had so many people that came up to me and go, you know what? Thank you for that. I see these characteristics, and it's helping me learn to deal with this death. Because you start to see the characteristics that I've just outlined for you. And people find healing in that. They go, oh, now I understand it better. So you'll start to kind of, and it may help you understand and get some closure on your life on that particular issue. And then the third category is this, and I want to be really clear on this. If you're struggling with depression, or you know somebody that is, let me say this categorically. Suicide is not your solution. It never is. And you may get to a point where you think it is, and I want these words to ring in your mind and remember this. It is not a solution. In fact, I was reluctant to preach this message because I don't want to somehow send this sort of green light that this is the easy way out. It's not. But I do want to also tell you that you have to understand this, and particularly if you're a family member, you have to understand this illness. Otherwise, you're going to say things and do things, you're going to marginalize and minimize it, and it could end up with tragic results. This is not something that should be taken lightly. It's a very serious condition that may result in death, and often does, simply because people don't talk about it, they're not given permission to talk about it, and they don't understand it. So if you have it, or if you are struggling with it, do everything that you can to understand it. Otherwise, it could have dramatic and drastic results. And finally, this. We need to have grace and wisdom when it comes to this topic. And just because you have had some experiences with it does not make you an expert in it. And more harm is done by people that have had some experiences, either suffering through it or a loved one, that then make sweeping comments. Because just because you went through something doesn't make you an expert in it. And it really hurts people. So when you kind of say the snarky things on Facebook, or you make the snarky comments, or you say these sort of sweeping definitive statements, what it does, it hurts people who've gone through it. It really hurts. It kind of opens up old wounds. And even more importantly, and this is what I want us to get, this is the most important part of it, when you make statements and you don't understand what you're saying, you rob people of the opportunity to get help, because you make them feel like they can just make a choice to be happy, or make a choice to be loved, or make a choice to act with courage. And that's not how this disease works. So guard your heart and guard your tongue. And don't pretend to understand something unless you really, really do. Okay? The church needs to do a better job at understanding this, or the results will often end in disaster. I know. Okay? And if I can help, I'd love to. Understand it better? God bless you guys. Have a great weekend.
Running, oh, just to know.